They said the most dangerous thing at a wedding isn't jealousy, it's intention. Emily Carter learned that truth the moment a thick ivory envelope arrived at her apartment in downtown Chicago, resting on the kitchen counter like it belonged there more than she did. The return address was unmistakable, Jason Whitmore. Inside was an invitation printed on expensive textured cardstock, the kind reserved for people who never had to think about cost. The words were polite, almost elegant, yet something about them felt rehearsed, sharpened. We would love you to witness our happiness. Witness, not celebrate, not share, just witness. Emily stood still for a long time, the city humming faintly beyond her window, as if the world had already decided what role she would play. 3 years earlier, she had been the woman beside Jason Whitmore when his career was still fragile, when late nights and shared takeout defined their future. She had believed in building something together, even when it meant setting her own ambitions aside. But memories don't arrive in order. They arrive in fragments. Her empty desk, her unfinished degree application, the moment Jason stopped asking for her opinion before making decisions. And then the silence that followed everything she had once been part of. Now, the invitation felt less like a gesture and more like a carefully placed object in a larger design. Still, she accepted, not out of hope, but out of curiosity for what kind of ending Jason Whitmore believed he could stage. On the night of the wedding, the Whitmore estate in Lake Forest glowed under thousands of soft lights, its marble steps filled with guests who spoke in low, polished tones. The air smelled like champagne and fresh orchids, every detail curated to perfection. Emily arrived alone, her dress simple but intentional, her presence unnoticed at first as she moved through the edges of the crowd. Jason saw her eventually. He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he smiled as if he had been waiting for a cue. When the ceremony transitioned into the reception, the master of ceremonies raised his glass and, with a tone too casual to be accidental, referenced past chapters, mistakes learned, and the importance of moving forward from old distractions. Laughter followed, light, rehearsed, socially acceptable. Emily didn't react. She simply stood still, hands steady, eyes unreadable, as if she were observing someone else's story being performed on stage. Jason's new bride leaned in, whispering something that made him chuckle, and for a brief moment, it seemed the room had collectively agreed on a version of history where Emily Carter was simply a footnote. But what no one in that room understood was that silence is not absence, it is preparation. And as Emily turned slightly toward the glass doors leading to the terrace, unaware glances followed her movement, because something about the way she carried herself did not belong to the story they thought they were telling. It belonged to something else entirely, something still unseen, still waiting. The air inside the estate felt heavier after Emily Carter stepped onto the terrace, not because anything had changed, but because attention always changes the weight of a room when it turns without permission. Behind her, the celebration continued in soft waves of laughter and clinking glass. Yet out here the night in Lake Forest felt colder, sharper, as if it had been waiting for someone who no longer belonged to the story being told inside. Emily placed one hand lightly on the stone railing, her posture calm, her breathing steady, the kind of stillness that does not ask for space but takes it naturally. She had not come here expecting recognition, and she certainly had not come for acknowledgement. She had come because some invitations are not about presence, but about control, and she understood that difference now in a way she never had before. Inside, Jason Whitmore was still the center of gravity. He moved through his guests with practiced ease, accepting congratulations, laughing at the right moments, playing the version of himself that had been carefully refined over years of ambition and presentation. Yet every few moments, his eyes drifted toward the terrace doors, as if checking whether a chapter he thought he had closed might reopen itself without warning. His new bride remained close, smiling for photographs, unaware of the subtle tension that seemed to follow Jason's attention whenever it left her side. Emily, meanwhile, did not look back immediately. Instead, she focused on the city lights in the distance beyond the estate grounds, where Chicago shimmered faintly like a memory that refused to settle. She remembered a different version of herself standing in smaller apartments, counting bills, adjusting plans, believing that loyalty meant endurance. There had been a time when Jason's world felt like hers too, when decisions were shared and futures were imagined as a single line instead of two separate paths. But memory has a way of editing itself, removing emotion while keeping evidence, and what remained for Emily now was clarity without noise. The sound of footsteps behind her was soft but deliberate. Jason had stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him, as if even this moment required control. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was not physical. It was made of time, choices, and everything that had been left unsaid in the years after separation. Jason studied her face, expecting perhaps something familiar, something that would confirm the version of her he still carried in his mind. But what he saw did not match that expectation. Emily turned slightly, acknowledging his presence without urgency, without invitation. The silence between them was not empty. It was structured, like a space that had been rebuilt differently. Jason began to speak, carefully at first, as if selecting words that would preserve his own version of the evening. He referenced the past indirectly, the way people do when they want to soften responsibility without admitting intent. Emily listened without interruption. Her expression did not shift, but something in her stillness suggested that she was no longer translating his words through emotion. She was observing them as data. Inside the estate, a server passed by the glass doors and glanced toward them briefly before continuing, unaware that the conversation unfolding outside carried no need for witnesses. Jason tried to smile at one point, the same smile he used inside when the room needed reassurance, but here it landed differently, without support from an audience. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet, measured, not defensive, not emotional, simply present. And in that moment, something subtle changed in Jason's posture, though neither of them acknowledged it. The night air remained unchanged, but the balance between them did not. Emily Carter did not move when Jason Whitmore finished speaking, because moving would have meant acknowledging that his words still carried weight, and she had already decided that they no longer did. The night air on the terrace remained cool, carrying faint traces of music and laughter from inside the estate. But out here, everything felt suspended, as if the world had paused to observe a conversation that no longer belonged to the past they once shared. Jason waited for a reaction that did not come, and for the first time that evening, uncertainty began to surface in the smallest details of his posture, in the way his hands adjusted his cuff links without purpose. Emily finally turned her gaze toward him, not with anger, not with nostalgia, but with a kind of calm recognition that made the silence between them heavier than any argument could have been. She spoke slowly, each word measured, as if she had rehearsed honesty long before this moment and no longer needed approval to express it. She did not accuse him. She did not remind him of what was lost. Instead, she described absence itself, the gradual distance that had formed long before separation became official, the way decisions had stopped being shared and became simply announced, the way her voice had slowly stopped being part of the rooms they once called home. Jason listened, and for a brief moment, the version of himself that had controlled rooms like this one seemed less certain. Inside the estate, guests continued to circulate, unaware that the foundation of one familiar story was being quietly examined just beyond the glass doors. A waiter passed near the terrace and slowed slightly, sensing tension without understanding it, before continuing back into the warmth of celebration. Jason tried to regain control of the moment by shifting the subject, referencing success, progress, and the future of his company, as if professional achievement could stabilize emotional imbalance. Emily let him finish without interruption. When she responded, her tone did not rise. It did not fall. It simply clarified that the future he was describing no longer included her in any form that required validation or permission. For the first time, Jason's practiced confidence did not provide him with an immediate answer. There was a pause, small but noticeable, where he seemed to search for a version of the conversation that would return him to familiar ground, but none appeared. Emily glanced briefly toward the glass doors, where silhouettes of guests moved beneath soft golden lighting, and for a moment she observed the life she had once been part of as if it belonged to another narrative entirely. Then, without drama, she returned her attention to Jason. He asked a question, softer now, less certain, something about whether she had come tonight expecting anything. Emily did not answer immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was precise, as if every possible interpretation had been weighed and dismissed. When she finally spoke, it was not to explain her presence, but to reveal its absence of expectation. She had not come to reclaim anything, nor to relive anything. She had come because closure is sometimes not given. It is observed from a distance until it no longer requires participation. Jason's expression shifted subtly at that, not into anger, but into something more complicated, something closer to realization without acceptance. The music from inside changed tempo, a softer song replacing the earlier rhythm, and through the glass, guests raised their glasses in synchronized celebration, unaware that outside, the structure of a private history was no longer aligning in the way it once had. Emily stepped slightly away from the railing, not leaving, not staying, simply repositioning herself within a space that no longer defined her. Jason remained where he was, watching her as if trying to locate the point where the version of their story he understood had stopped being accurate. And in that quiet distance between them, something irreversible had already begun to settle. The shift began in a way that no one inside the Whitmore estate would have noticed at first, because the most important changes in a room rarely announced themselves with noise. Emily Carter remained on the terrace as the music inside softened into a new rhythm, slower and more intimate, as if the celebration had moved on without needing to resolve what had just happened at the glass doors. Jason Whitmore stood a few feet away from her now, no longer approaching, no longer retreating, suspended in a space where control no longer felt automatic. He had built his confidence on certainty, on the idea that every conversation could eventually be guided back to his advantage, but tonight that instinct was no longer responding the way it used to. Emily adjusted her posture slightly, not as a reaction to him, but as a return to herself, as if the air itself required a different version of her presence. Inside the estate, laughter rose and fell in waves, but out here the silence between them had taken on structure, something almost architectural, built from everything they had not said over the years. Jason tried again, this time with less performance in his tone, asking about her life after the separation, framing it as curiosity, but there was an undertone of control he did not fully recognize in himself. Emily answered without hesitation, describing her life in simple terms, not to invite judgment or sympathy, but to remove the illusion that her absence had been static. She spoke of work that required discipline, of days that did not depend on approval, of mornings where silence was no longer uncomfortable but necessary. Each sentence she spoke removed another layer of assumption Jason had carried about her. He listened, and for the first time, he did not interrupt, because interruption would have required certainty, and certainty was becoming harder to maintain. The terrace lights above them cast a soft glow across the stone floor, and for a brief moment, Emily's shadow and Jason's shadow stood close, but did not overlap, as if even their silhouettes understood the separation more clearly than they did. Inside, a photographer captured images of guests raising glasses, freezing moments of happiness that required no explanation. Outside, time felt less cooperative, less willing to organize itself into familiar patterns. Jason shifted his weight and asked another question, quieter now, something about whether she had ever thought about returning, not to him directly, but to what they had built together. The question lingered in the air longer than expected. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him toward the distant city skyline, where Chicago's lights shimmered like a memory that no longer needed ownership. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no hesitation, only recognition of distance that could not be reversed by intention alone. She explained that returning implies continuity, and continuity requires something intact to return to. Jason did not respond right away. His expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the discomfort of realizing that some structures do not collapse loudly. They simply stop holding weight. From inside, a shift in music signaled another moment of celebration, a cue for guests to move closer together for photographs. Through the glass, Emily could see movement, coordination, the choreography of a perfect evening continuing without interruption. Jason followed her gaze briefly, as if trying to understand how the inside and outside of this night had become so different in meaning. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke her name, not as a command, not as a question, but as something closer to memory testing its own accuracy. Emily turned back to him calmly. There was no reaction that suggested reopening, no signal that invited negotiation. Instead, there was clarity, quiet and unshaken. Jason exhaled slowly, as if realizing that the version of the evening he had prepared for no longer had a place to land. And in that realization, the distance between them did not grow or shrink. It simply became undeniable. The evening inside the Whitmore estate continued unfolding as if nothing outside the terrace doors had changed. But for Emily Carter and Jason Whitmore, the night had already shifted into something that no longer followed the rhythm of the celebration. Emily stood slightly apart now, no longer pressed against the railing, her presence steady in a way that did not invite interruption. Jason remained within a few feet of her, yet the space between them felt wider than the physical distance suggested, shaped by years that no longer aligned in meaning. Inside the estate, the music transitioned again, this time into a more energetic tone, signaling a new phase of the event where guests would move closer together for formal photographs and speeches. Through the glass, flashes of light from cameras began to pulse intermittently, capturing moments of curated happiness. Jason glanced inside briefly, as if reminded of the role he was expected to return to, but his attention kept drifting back to Emily, as though something unresolved had anchored him outside. Emily broke the silence first, not with confrontation, but with precision. She spoke about time, not as something that heals or damages, but as something that reveals structure. She described how certain relationships do not end suddenly, but gradually lose alignment until continuation becomes a performance rather than a shared direction. Jason listened without interruption, his expression controlled but no longer fully confident. He responded cautiously, attempting to reframe their history through shared milestones, referencing moments that once defined them as a unit. Emily did not reject his words, but she did not reinforce them either. Instead, she acknowledged them as past coordinates that no longer pointed to the same destination. Inside, a staff member moved across the ballroom adjusting lighting for the next segment of the evening, unaware that the most significant shift of the night was occurring outside the scheduled program. Jason asked a question that carried less authority than before, something closer to uncertainty, asking whether she believed everything between them had been inevitable. The question lingered. Emily considered it, not emotionally, but with the calmness of someone observing a completed equation. When she answered, her voice carried a clarity that did not seek agreement. She explained that inevitability implies lack of choice, but what she experienced was not absence of choice. It was accumulation of decisions that no longer supported the same future. Jason exhaled slowly, his gaze briefly breaking away toward the interior where laughter rose again as guests prepared for a group toast. For a moment, he looked like someone standing at the edge of a familiar system that was continuing without him. Emily followed his glance toward the ballroom, where chandeliers cast warm light over coordinated movement, glasses lifted in synchronized celebration. The contrast between inside and outside was no longer subtle, it was structural. Jason turned back toward her and asked quietly if she had ever missed what they were. There was no sharpness in his voice now, only a kind of delayed recognition seeking confirmation. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to settle fully, not as avoidance, but as completion. When she finally spoke, her words did not carry nostalgia or regret. They carried finality without emphasis. She stated that missing something requires belief in its continued existence in a form worth returning to. Jason did not respond. His expression shifted slightly, not toward anger, but toward an understanding he could not yet organize into language. Inside, the toast began, glasses raised, voices unified in celebration. Outside, no such unity formed. Emily stepped slightly further away from the glass doors, not leaving the estate, but no longer positioned within its narrative center. Jason remained where he was, watching her as if attempting to locate the point where interpretation had failed. And in that stillness, the separation between them became less about distance and more about permanence. The moment after the toast inside the Whitmore estate felt like a subtle reset, as if the celebration had officially moved into its final act, while the real story remained outside on the terrace where Emily Carter and Jason Whitmore stood in a silence that no longer required explanation. Inside, applause rose in controlled waves, glasses returned to tables, and guests shifted into casual conversations that carried the ease of people who believed the night had been successful. Outside, however, nothing about the exchange between Emily and Jason followed that rhythm. Emily remained composed, her attention no longer tied to the interior scene, but instead resting in a quiet awareness of herself that did not depend on acknowledgement from anyone else. Jason, standing a short distance away, seemed less anchored than before, as if the structure of the evening that he had carefully constructed was no longer providing the stability he expected. He glanced toward the ballroom again, where his new bride was now speaking with guests, her presence framed by soft lighting and polite attention. Yet his focus returned to Emily with increasing difficulty. Emily spoke first, not because she needed to, but because silence had already completed its purpose. She described, in simple and steady terms, how distance is not always physical, how it often begins long before separation becomes visible, in moments where priorities shift quietly and conversations lose shared direction. Jason listened, but his responses were no longer immediate. He attempted to reference shared history again, as if continuity could be re-established through memory alone, but Emily did not engage with that framing. Instead, she acknowledged the memory without attaching it to obligation. Inside the estate, a staff member adjusted the seating arrangement for the final segment of the evening, unaware that the most decisive transition had already occurred outside the program. Jason asked a question that carried less confidence than before, asking whether she believed things could have been different if timing or circumstance had changed. The question hung between them longer than expected. Emily did not reject it outright. She considered it with the calm precision of someone who had already examined every variation of that possibility. When she answered, her tone was even, not dismissive, not emotional, but final in its structure. She explained that change requires shared direction, not just altered conditions, and that timing cannot correct what intention does not sustain. Jason looked briefly toward the interior again, where guests were beginning to prepare for the final photographs of the evening, aligning themselves under chandeliers that reflected warm light across polished surfaces. For a moment, he seemed to recognize that the world inside continued to function without interruption, regardless of what was unraveling outside. Emily followed his gaze, observing the contrast without commentary. There was no longer any attempt to reconcile the two spaces. Jason then asked, more quietly than before, whether she had truly moved forward or whether distance had simply created the appearance of change. Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, and responded without hesitation that moving forward is not a performance visible to others, but a decision that no longer requires validation from the past. Jason did not respond immediately. His silence now carried a different quality, less defensive, more reflective, as if he was encountering a version of understanding that did not provide leverage or reversal. Inside, laughter rose again, softer now, signaling the evening's gradual conclusion. Outside, the terrace remained unchanged, but the dynamic between them had settled into something irreversible. Emily stepped once more toward the edge of the terrace, not as departure, but as alignment with a direction that no longer included negotiation. Jason stayed where he was, watching her with an expression that no longer sought to interpret, only to comprehend. And in that final stillness, the separation between past and present became complete without a single additional word. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore estate began to shift again, not through any announcement, but through the subtle change in attention among the guests who slowly started to notice that something beyond the planned sequence of the evening was drawing focus away from the center of the ballroom. Emily Carter remained on the terrace, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not seek validation from the activity inside, while Jason Whitmore stood closer now than before, as if proximity could restore clarity to a situation that no longer responded to familiarity. The sound of laughter from inside continued, but it felt more distant, as if the room itself was beginning to split into layers of awareness. Jason adjusted his stance and attempted once more to reclaim conversational control, referencing the success of the evening, the importance of presence, and the expectations tied to appearances in environments like this, but his words no longer carried the same certainty they once had. Emily listened without interruption, not because she agreed, but because she no longer needed to correct anything that depended on performance. Inside, a brief ripple of movement passed through the guests near the entrance hall, a subtle turning of heads, the kind of reaction that happens when attention is redirected by something unplanned entering a controlled space. A staff member near the doorway spoke quietly into a communication device, and within moments, a few guests began to shift their positions toward the main entrance. Jason noticed the change and paused mid-sentence, his gaze moving past Emily toward the interior, where conversations were now fragmenting into small clusters of speculation. Emily followed his glance only briefly, observing without attachment, as if the reaction of the room belonged to a different narrative that she was no longer required to interpret. Jason took a step closer to the glass doors, his expression tightening slightly as he tried to assess what was disrupting the flow of his carefully structured event. For the first time that evening, uncertainty was no longer contained between him and Emily, but had begun to extend into the environment around them. Inside the ballroom, the lighting remained elegant, the music still playing at a controlled volume, but the rhythm of the space had changed in a way that was not immediately visible, yet unmistakably felt by those sensitive to shifts in social equilibrium. A few guests began to raise their phones discreetly, not in celebration, but in anticipation, as if expecting the arrival of someone or something that had not been included in the original program. Jason turned back toward Emily, his expression no longer composed in the same way, asking her if she had arranged anything beyond this evening, the question carrying more tension than intention. Emily met his gaze calmly, her expression unchanged, and responded only with silence that did not confirm or deny, but instead removed the question from its assumed authority. Inside, the movement near the entrance increased slightly, and the staff presence became more coordinated, suggesting that access was being managed differently than before. Jason exhaled slowly, glancing again toward the interior where the guests had now shifted their attention almost fully toward the main doors. Emily remained still, observing neither with concern nor curiosity, but with the same measured awareness she had carried throughout the evening, as if what was unfolding was simply the continuation of a structure already set in motion long before this night began. Jason spoke again, softer now, asking what she intended to achieve by remaining here without explanation, but the question felt less like accusation and more like an attempt to locate stability in a situation that no longer offered it. Emily's answer did not arrive immediately, and when it did, it carried no emotional escalation, only clarity that did not require agreement. She stated that not everything that unfolds in a single evening is initiated within that evening, and that some arrivals are not interruptions, but confirmations. At that moment, the interior doors of the estate opened wider than before, and the attention of every guest inside converged toward the entrance, signaling that whatever was about to happen had already moved beyond speculation. Jason turned fully toward the ballroom now, his attention pulled away from Emily for the first time in a way that was not voluntary. And in that shift, the evening crossed a threshold that could no longer be reversed by explanation or control. The shift inside the Whitmore estate became undeniable as the main doors opened wider, and the attention of every guest inside the ballroom converged toward the entrance with a synchronized pause that felt almost rehearsed, even though no one had planned it. Emily Carter remained on the terrace, her position unchanged, observing the reaction not as a participant, but as someone witnessing the final stage of a process that had already been set in motion long before this evening began. Jason Whitmore stood closer to the glass doors now, his earlier confidence replaced by a more restrained stillness, as if the structure he had relied on to interpret social control was no longer responding correctly. Inside, the music softened slightly without stopping, and the lighting remained elegant, but the energy of the room had shifted from celebration to anticipation. Guests were no longer fully engaged in conversation. Instead, their attention gathered toward the entrance in layered silence, broken only by the subtle movement of staff adjusting positions near the doorway. A few phones were raised discreetly, not in celebration, but in expectation of something that had not been part of the scheduled evening. Jason's gaze moved between the interior and Emily, as if attempting to determine whether she had any connection to the shift unfolding inside. But Emily offered no reaction that could be interpreted as confirmation or denial. Her stillness remained composed, not defensive, not reactive, simply present in a way that no longer invited interpretation from anyone else. The doors at the entrance remained open, and through them, a faint change in lighting suggested that someone or something was approaching the threshold of visibility. The guests inside adjusted their positions instinctively, forming a quiet corridor of attention that led from the entrance toward the center of the ballroom. Jason stepped slightly forward, his expression tightening, as he tried to regain understanding of the situation through observation alone. But every familiar cue he had relied on throughout the evening was no longer aligning with predictable outcomes. Emily finally turned her gaze toward the interior, not out of curiosity, but with a calm awareness that confirmed she had not been surprised by the direction of events. Inside, the staff presence became more structured, indicating coordination rather than confusion, and the movement near the entrance stabilized into a controlled stillness that suggested arrival rather than interruption. Jason spoke quietly, asking Emily again what she had set in motion, but his question carried less authority than before, more like an attempt to anchor reality through explanation. Emily did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to extend naturally until it became its own form of answer. When she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, explaining that certain outcomes are not introduced at the moment they appear, but are revealed when conditions finally align to make them visible. Inside the ballroom, the anticipation reached its peak as guests collectively faced the entrance, and the atmosphere shifted from expectation to recognition of presence. Jason followed their line of sight, and for the first time that evening, he was no longer analyzing the situation through familiarity, but reacting to something that had already surpassed it. Emily remained still on the terrace, her posture unchanged, as if the moment unfolding inside had already been accounted for in her understanding of the night. And in that final convergence of attention, the evening reached a point where everything that had been uncertain began to take form in silence. The moment the doors of the Whitmore estate fully opened, the entire ballroom fell into a controlled silence that was not requested but collectively obeyed, as if every guest inside had instinctively understood that the evening had reached its final turning point. Emily Carter remained on the terrace, her presence unchanged, observing the interior not as someone waiting for confirmation, but as someone witnessing the completion of a structure she had already understood long before it became visible. Jason Whitmore stood closer to the glass now, his attention locked on the entrance, where the atmosphere had shifted from anticipation to recognition. Inside, the guests parted slightly, forming a clear path toward the center of the ballroom, and the lighting seemed to adjust subtly, not brighter, not dimmer, but more focused, as if the room itself was acknowledging arrival. Emily did not move. Her expression remained steady, calm in a way that did not invite speculation or emotional interpretation. Jason's posture tightened slightly as he tried to process what was unfolding without losing control of his composure, but the environment no longer responded to his internal logic. The guests inside were no longer reacting to him either. Their attention had fully migrated to the entrance. And then, the figure stepped inside. Dante Romano entered without urgency, his presence defined not by movement, but by the immediate recalibration of attention within the room. Conversation stopped entirely. Glasses lowered without instruction. Even the soft background music seemed to lose relevance as the atmosphere reorganized itself around his arrival. Jason recognized him within seconds, and that recognition did not come with relief, but with a quiet disruption of certainty. Dante Romano was not introduced. He did not need to be. The reaction of the room carried his identity more clearly than any announcement could. Emily, still on the terrace, observed the shift without surprise, as if the final piece of the evening had simply taken its place. Jason turned partially toward Emily, then back toward the interior, as if trying to determine where the origin of this moment truly belonged. But there was no longer a single point of reference that explained the entire situation. Dante moved forward slowly, not toward the center stage, but into the space where attention naturally settled around him. Guests adjusted their positions subtly, not out of fear or excitement, but out of recognition of hierarchy that did not require explanation. Jason took a step forward, attempting to re-establish presence, but the attempt felt out of sequence with the environment now responding to a different axis of control. Dante stopped near the center of the ballroom, his gaze briefly scanning the room before settling with quiet precision. Emily finally stepped inside from the terrace, her movement calm and deliberate, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the direction of attention shifted again. Jason's eyes moved between Emily and Dante, and for the first time, his expression reflected something closer to realization than uncertainty. Dante's attention settled briefly on Emily, not as surprise, but as confirmation. Then, without raising his voice, he acknowledged her presence in a way that immediately altered how everyone in the room interpreted her role in the evening. Jason remained frozen in place, as the structure he had relied on to define status and control dissolved into a hierarchy he could no longer navigate. Emily did not approach Dante, nor did she look toward Jason. Instead, she stood in stillness that no longer required justification. And in that silence, the entire ballroom understood that what they had witnessed was not an interruption, but a conclusion that had already been decided long before the doors opened.